Welcome back to another episode of Acceptable Chess. I'm your host, John Harden. Here with me offering live commentary is National Master Andrew Hoy. And we are looking at some very exciting matchups today. We have the top two boards in the Bachelor Memorial Chess Tournament. And actually, lo and behold, much to my surprise, a third game going on between two more of our combatants. That being between Bill Baxter Stoltzfus and Dave Morrissey. So very exciting. We're going to get actually three games today that we're going to take a look at. And I, for one, could not be more excited. So it does look like we've already started some of the action here. Let's take a look at our top board. Andrew, what do you have to say about this position?
Well, it looks like they started off with an Alekhines defense, which is kind of an exciting opening. It's a way for Black to immediately try and strike back in the center. We did talk an awful lot about these new openings and the not playing classically, and that's kind of how the game started. So Aaron played a sideline with knight c3. The main lines are d4 or c4, and it usually transposes to the same thing. So knight c3 is definitely a sideline. And then Rufus ended up capturing on c3, and you can take back with either the b or the d pawns. Aaron chose to take back with the b pawn, which reinforces his center nicely. And Rufus correctly started to fight back immediately in the center with d6. Now Aaron has played this move bishop b5, which is a little bit unusual, and we'll have to see what happens there. We're pinning the knight right away. The bishop usually wants to be on d3 in these lines, though, so that white can start to attack on the king side and eye this h7 square.
Interesting. So once again, we see a tendency in this tournament to place the bishop, the light squared bishop, on b5, and we're seeing a theme here that it is not always the best play. Not always the best play.
Yeah, you're definitely right.
Moving over here, I cannot help myself. We are already getting wet and wild in the Dave Morrissey, Bill Baxter Stoltzfus match. I misspoke earlier. Dave actually has the white pieces, and it looks like after a somewhat untraditional opening that we have already reached a position where white has made the decision to sacrifice the knight on f7 and bring Black's king out into the open to try for some kind of fast checkmating attack. Andrew, what do you think about his chances here?
Yeah, so this game started off with a classical opening. It's a normal Scotch-looking position, and now Black played the very surprising move d5. So this is a attempt to strike back in the center, but unfortunately White has a very strong response. White can just start capturing these pawns in the middle. And now in this position, White decided to take on f7, which is sacrificing a whole piece, and White in exchange is getting some good tricks on the light squares. So he has queen h5 ideas, he has bishop c4 ideas. He chose to play bishop c4, and after bishop c4, the king went back, and then we ended up playing, I believe, d5 happened, hitting the knight, and after knight e5, White has played bishop b5 check. So I don't know about bishop b5. I might have chosen to try something like queen h5 instead, which is going to force the knight back to either g6 or f7, and it lets you maintain the bishop on c4, where I think it's strongly placed. The key point here after queen h5 is that g6 hangs the entire knight, and more than that, the rook on h8 is going to fall, and White's just totally winning there.
Ouch, ouch, ouch. Yeah, trapped straight out of the wayward queen opening, where White plays that queen h5 move right away, and sometimes hopes to provoke this blunder of g6. But that looks like it's going to be an exciting game. We'll see how long White's initiative lasts.
Yes, definitely.
Looks like equal in excitement, returning to the top board here, that we have a decision by Rufus to allow this d5 move and a fatal-looking pin on the c6 knight. But he has this resource of a6, and it looks like we're going to get here, if I can just bring up a couple of moves here.
Sure.
It looks like we're going to get maybe something like either bishop takes on c6, right, followed by pawn takes and maybe pawn takes, or the other line that's of course possible is taking with pawn first and a takes b5, which opens Rufus Rook. That's probably a line I like a lot better for black. So, Andrew, it looked to me like you were thinking probably he'll take with bishop first.
I think so. I think taking with the pawn is definitely going to allow things to open up. Even in this position, white really doesn't want to take on b7 because this long diagonal really belongs to black here. And
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
are almost forced to play knight f3, and all of a sudden it looks like black's doing very well. It's a messy position. There's a lot going on, but there are good diagonals for both of black's bishops, and I think black will be able to untangle with an advantage.
Yeah, I gotta say, I really love the activity there, and the fact that this bishop takes f3 move is always out there as an opportunity. We have natural play with bringing the bishop to g7 and castling. Yeah, that looks really strong for black. So we'll see. I don't think that Aaron has made a decision yet. Yeah, absolutely, but that does look like the wiser course of action.
Yes, definitely.
Very exciting. We will, in probably about another 20 minutes, have the match between Charlie Larimer and Alex Host starting. So we're going to have 3 games at once here to juggle. Much more action than we had last time we made this live commentary.
Yeah, it should be good. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and it will certainly keep things moving to look at this many games at the same time. So that'll be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, really exciting. Really exciting. So, okay, it looks like we do have some movement in the Stave Morrison back Stoltz game, if I can be so brief. Black has made the decision. Let me see if I can move things around here, keep us up to date.
Yeah, it looks
but
like
black
white defended the bishop with knight c3, which looks like a normal way to play, and then black pins the knight, so there's no more defense of this bishop on b5, so it's going to force white to respond with something active. White chose to play f4, and that looks very surprising. John, what do you think about f4?
Yeah, it's not a kind of move that I'm a fan of. One of the things that I'm always looking at when this move comes is the potential fatalities that can happen with the queen entering in h4. Now, of course, white will have this resource of g3 here, but maybe even there we could end up in some trouble at some point because the f3 square will then be weak. Although it does look like this initial move is no good because after something like g3 and knight f3, white has the very surprising queen sacrifice of queen takes knight.
Yes.
Realizing, of course, it's not a true sack at all, we will regather our queen on g takes h4. So it looks like that's not working right away, but I have to say, like, long term, this fills me with deep suspicion, this f4 move.
Yeah, I agree, and I think more than that, the way that black continued by taking with check, this looks like it's leading to a very nice position, in fact. So here, after bishop takes, we notice that the bishop on b5 is hanging. That's okay because the e5 knight is hanging as well, but now white played bishop d2, which looks like it sacrifices another piece.
Oof. Yeah, absolutely.
And calling this a sacrifice might be it might just be losing a piece. So, and here white decided to go for broke. So taking and allowing things like queen h4 and queen g4 to stop castling, that doesn't look attractive. So white decided to try long castles and see if he can make something happen here.
Oof, man, this position is falling apart very quickly. Very quickly.
Yeah, and it looks like we've caught up to the live game after knight f7. I think this just looks completely winning for black. Black is up 3 whole pieces. His king is in the center and he can't castle, but I don't think that will be the biggest issue that he has to face.
No, it's tough, right? I mean, if you could find some way to open the position quickly, right? If, for example, white were lucky enough to be able to play 2 moves in a row and be able to take on e4, at least we would have some decent attacking chances on the exposed king. But honestly, it feels like after something like rook h to e1 and then knight f6, this pawn is holding solid in the center, and it's really difficult to even get too many open lines. So black, of course, cannot castle. I'm making catching my own mistake there because he took earlier on f7. But he should still be able to manage something close to what we call castling by hand. Right, and be able to get the king out of dodge here, maybe moving the king up and bringing the rook over, or even just leaving the king for now, trying to move this knight to d6 to make sure this pawn can never come forward and create any open lines, right, and castling by hand this way. something like that should give him a nice cozy home with no interference.
I agree, and that looks very strong for black. In any position where you have three extra pawns, there's usually something good. Three extra pieces, excuse me. There's usually something good.
Let's go back to our top game here for a minute because, Andrew, I am seeing a pretty crazy pawn structure developing for both sides. And the resolution to our big question from earlier, which is how is this light squared bishop going to take itself out of the game?
Yeah, and it looks like white decided to give up the bishop on a4 instead to cripple black's pawn structure. So I like this idea in general. This is a somewhat common idea in the Roy Lopez. So now we end up with both of these pawns still on the board, but now black has these double isolated a pawns, and white's pawn on c6 actually does a pretty good job of restricting the pieces. So that's a decent way to continue here.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. I have to say, it's hard for me to crow too much in white's favor because as much as these are bad pawns, I can't think that these tripled c pawns are so spectacular either.
Yeah,
But
I agree.
am I missing something there? Oh,
No,
okay.
it's I think it's just messy pawn structures for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not a very classical looking game. Although I think the moves by both sides have been very reasonable, but totally unexpected that we've reached such an unusual position.
Yeah, and after a couple more normal moves, this is kind of the time when white had to come up with the first real decision in the last couple of moves. So now white has to decide how to clarify the pawn structure. So is he going to leave this pawn on e5 and maybe try and defend it with a move like queen e2? Is he going to push it to e6 and sacrifice it, which I don't like at all because the bishop can capture? And white decided to capture on d6, and we are now looking at this position, and this is the live position.
Yeah, I gotta say, I wonder if there was something better there. I mean, I understand the idea of maybe trying to trade off a potential liability, as of course black did have the idea of, for example, bishop g4, right, and threatening to just win the pawn outright. But this seems to make things easier on black, and I really love what this does to his dark squared bishop in particular, just raking down the center of the board.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, one interesting line, if black takes on c3, this bishop is so strong that I would consider a move like d7, just temporarily giving away the entire rook in order to force this bishop to trade itself off.
Yeah, I can see the worth of that, right? Absolutely. Some decent attacking chances there. It's crazy. I mean, this game is, if it goes this way, it's going to get wild and wilder still. But, really, it's hard to say how black could do anything but play bishop g7, and then maybe we can take right away, right? And now at least white has the exposure of the king to give him some kind of compensation for some strange material imbalance.
Yeah, it looks like when everything settles, white's going to be down an exchange in this line. Again, I don't think this will happen, but you can look at lines like this, and we would just have an extra exchange as black in exchange for this knight, and maybe some ideas of attacking by pushing this h-pawn, a la f0.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've seen a lot of games. Some of my students have been bringing to my attention that also the Magnuson and Hikaru matches have featured a lot of this A or H pawn being pushed up the board early in the game. So not to be underestimated, even in the hands of amateurs.
Yeah, and it looks like instead black chose to take back on d6 with the e pawn. I might have considered taking back with the c pawn, and this move, bishop g5, kind of highlights why. Now after queen e8, again, bishop f6 would have been an idea, even f6 is an idea here. But after queen e8, rook e1, white is certainly getting a lot of tempi on the queen here. And now black is going to have to play bishop e6 to, at some point, to kind of control the e-file.
Is there such a problem here with queen to c6?
No, I think that's fine. I just think that sooner or later the bishop is going to have to come to e6.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, there will be some problems there. I can even see the difficulty of just how restricted the rook is, and your ability to harass it could be very annoying. Knight d4 here, also a strong way to continue, as black probably does not want to take the obvious capture to reduce the pressure on his queen.
Yes, exactly.
Very good. Moving back to Morrissey versus Baxter Stoltzfus. Oh dear, it does look like we've got a bit of a blunder on board. Let's see if Dave picks up on it. Bill has just played the ill-fated rook to f1, which exposes his rook to capture from the a6 bishop. So if Dave picks this up, we could be looking at a bit of a blowout.
Yeah, so to catch up with the live game, Black defended the e4 pawn with the knight. Then White attacked yet again, so he's threatening rook e4. In this position, there's no reason not to sacrifice an exchange. You're already down this much material. Anything is better than suffering. Black decided to defend that yet again, and after a4, bishop a6, now we get to the position that John referenced with rook f1, and Black did indeed take the rook off here, and this is the live position. And I think Black is just up a prohibitive amount of material, and White really doesn't have any attacking chances with these two knights in the middle of the board.
That is unfortunate. That is unfortunate. I'll be interested to see the post-game analysis, maybe have a conversation with those players. But just goes to show that one of the earliest rungs on the ladder, and one that you can never stop practicing, is just your simple tactical vision of being able to see the whole board, because it can prevent many a disaster and save many a game.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So we do have the line that you posited in our top game. It does look like we have this idea on board now of queen to e8, followed by rook to e1, and now the queen taking the pawn on c6, rather than going into the self-pin with bishop to e6. So some interesting tension still on the board. Black has to be commended for his excellent bishops, I have to say, right? This dark square bishop has already been talked about, but now we've got a chance here, instead of playing bishop e6, to maybe consider putting this bishop on b7, and we've got both long diagonals, which of course creates the obvious blunder opportunity of White moves the knight and Black gets home immediately with queen takes g2.
Yeah, so I think both players are strong enough that they won't hang a mate in one. But at this moment, I definitely like Black. I think Black's already up one pawn. Not that we really count these a pawns as two pawns, but the c3 pawn is doomed at this point. And I think the light squares are just going to be extremely strong for Black. And I really like this bishop b7 idea that you threw out there in order to connect rooks and finish development.
Absolutely. I think you can always see when I make comments like that just how much bullet I am playing, because these little nagging checkmate threats that are so easy to remember with strong players in a classical game can really pay off quite a bit when you were playing with less than a minute for both sides. An awful lot of hung checkmates have both won and lost me games.
Yes, no kidding. It's definitely the curse of bullet chess. It's always these checkmates that you hang at when you don't want to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's see what else we have going on here. A little bit of a sit and think period as we look back at the Morrissey Baxter Stoltzfus game. It does look like we've had a couple of moves here. Rook takes f1, followed by, let's back up here, keep track of things. So we have knight takes d5, queen d4, and then another couple of moves. The knight retreating back to f6, just playing nice and safe with the advantage, which I do like. White trying to create some kind of attack with queen e5 check, followed by queen e5 check, a very simple block of queen e7. Right.
And White correctly realized he can't trade. Trading is analogous to resigning immediately.
Exactly. As my coach likes to say, no queens, no a dick.
And I like this a5 idea. It's not common to develop a rook by lifting it to a6, unless you're a total beginner and you miss that the bishop can capture it there. But in this position where white doesn't have any bishops, this is a totally valid way to develop the rook and bring it into the attack.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really nice. I hope that that's the idea that
Yeah,
that
and we had
black
a
is
couple
going
more
for.
moves here. So this is now the live position, and it looks like black's going to decide what to do with the knight, and I think he just decided to play knight f5, attacking the queen.
Very, very solid.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's important. I just want to double check myself here that I clarify for the viewers and for myself that we do have Dave Morrissey playing with the white pieces. I may have misquoted and said that Bill had hung the capture of his rook on f1 before, but that was in error. So yeah, some nice play coming from Bill and by extension from black in this game. I like what I'm seeing. Bill's had a bit of an up and down tournament. I believe he is currently standing with 1 point going into round 5. So getting a win here, I think, probably makes him feel pretty good and gives him a chance to save his tournament. Of course, if he wins out, as I'm always fond of noting, when you win the last few games, it always feels like you won the whole thing.
Yes, definitely.
Very, very good. So as we wait for more action here, Andrew, how's your Saturday going?
It's pretty good. I obviously have been looking forward to this and looking at our games for a couple of days now. It's really nice that we could get the top two boards to play at the same time, so that works out exceptionally well from our perspective. And I think we should have a pretty good understanding of what's going on heading into the last two rounds after today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think probably we'll get things pretty clarified. Yeah, I have had an excellent morning. I have had my bagel and my coffee, so I came in fully prepared with everything I needed. And yeah, I have been excited about this event for a couple of days now. It's really wonderful to get to sit here, enjoy some chess live, share it with the community, and make a little bit more of an event out of this tournament.
Yes, definitely.
Interesting. So it does look like we have a couple more moves here in Morrissey versus Baxter Stoltzfus that I'd like to highlight, because after this nice move of a5, right, we had c4, e3, and then c5. So it does look like maybe black did not quite have this idea in mind of bringing the rook into play, as he did not take immediate advantage of it. I think probably if we back up here, instead of just pushing the pass pawn, which makes its own kind of sense, right? Something like rook to a6 and rook to c6, we would already be threatening to just win this pawn and force white to probably make a defensive move. And if he pushes, I think that could end up, actually, I suppose I should put the line on the board here. Why not? Let's say that white makes a passing move, right? If he pushes here, instead of playing something like b3, I think that maybe he ends up paying even more, as now the knights are getting very active, and this discovered attack on the pawn would probably bring a very quick end to the game. As once the heavy pieces start getting around your king, it might be time to say goodnight.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Although even in this position, it looks like there's really not much left for white to do in this position.
No, it's true. It's tough, but got to give credit for struggling on, right? You cannot win a game. No one ever won a game by resigning.
Absolutely, and you can always resign later. So when in doubt, play a couple more moves.
Absolutely. And we've seen in this tournament as well that it's not so easy to hold on and play accurately throughout the entire thing. We have a lot of developing players, a lot of learning players, and frankly, even our strongest boards are capable of occasionally letting something slip, and their entire position comes tumbling down. So I think anyone playing in this tournament should probably be playing on for as long as they feel comfortable.
Yes, definitely. So to look at our top board again, briefly, it looks like we have a couple more moves, or maybe precisely one more move from Aaron, and he brought the bishop back to d2 to slow down the attack on this c3 pawn. What do you think about trading on c3 in this position?
Um, I can't say that I like it. I think that this bishop d2 move is very passive, and while the bishop is not so thrilling on g5, right? Perhaps a reposition was in order. That dropping it back really makes me feel like I'm smelling blood. So the idea of trading my unbelievable bishop off for his kind of passively placed d2 thing, right? Bit of a tall pawn, as I like to joke. Making that trade for the gain of a doubled c pawn that I probably could pick up later anyway. I can't think that it's worth it. I mean, I love going up a pawn, but it seems like now at least White has simplified his defensive task and maybe could start to get something else going.
Yeah, I agree. I think the bishop on g7 is just such a strong piece for black. There's no need to trade it off right away. It looks like it did in fact get traded off, and we got to this position after rook e3 attacking the queen. And I still think that black is doing fantastically well. Black has 2 extra pawns, and that's certainly worth a little bit of suffering, as they say. But in this position, I do think that black has made more compromises than was necessary.
Yeah, I have to say, despite being down in material, knowing how capable Aaron is tactically, I have to feel like he's been given a bit of a gift. Like maybe there's a little more daylight coming through that tunnel than there was just a few moves ago.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how black responds to these active rooks over the next couple of moves.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, for just a moment here, I almost had a heart attack thinking that after this queen b2 move that is now on board, that we could trap the queen with something like rook to b1. But of course, I am making a bit of a rookie mistake, right? The departure effect is present in every game. This rook now is controlling the b file, but needed to be controlling the a file, as now black would have the very simple queen takes a2, going up a third pawn and giving himself at least one escape square on c4. Although I have to admit, the queen is really scarily unable to go to too many places.
Yeah, and in this position, I think one option would be to just lift the rook. This is controlling g4 and c4, so a move like bishop g4 is not possible. And white has the relatively straightforward idea of bringing all of the rooks to the king side and starting to attack like a madman.
Wow, yeah. I have to admit, I did not even think of this idea. Because I thought you were going for some kind of queen restriction plan, and I thought, well, okay, queen to e6 should give me back the d5 square, and maybe I can wriggle out. But yeah, this looks really scary. I'm interested to see if this is something that Aaron goes for. Of course, we have to be a little careful going for this rook h3 idea, as long as Rufus doesn't move his bishop, we're going to fall victim to that same error that White made in our other game of letting black pick off the exchange.
Yeah, and just let's close out the game between Dave and Bill at this point. It looks like White is ready to resign. I don't see anything else left for him to try as we look over in the lower right of the stream to see that position, and black has way too many queens to allow white to come back, I think.
Yeah, this is looking like a bit of a multiple ladies situation.
Yes,
I had several other comments.
Like the queen is hanging on e6, in fact. So I think there will either be mate momentarily or just too many queens. And it looks like it's actually a mate in one position if black finds queen d2.
Ooh, yeah, unfortunately, looks like black did miss it. You want to be careful here. White is running out of moves, and it is entirely possible that there could be a stalemate if black does not think about this carefully. You've got half an hour left. I know they can't hear me, but this is the sort of thing I yell at my students all the time.
Yes, exactly. And it does look like we've gotten the last game started. So we're going to pull that up on the lower right board. We're going to sadly replace the game that's over there now. I don't think we really need to watch the mate in one. We'll wait 1 second. We'll wait until he finds queen f1 or queen e2.
Could be that this is about to end. Let's give Bill his moment in the sun.
Yes, exactly.
There it is. Okay, queen to f1 ends the game. Well played. Very exciting attacking possibilities by white. Unfortunately, it just didn't quite come together.
Yeah, and then we can go through the first couple of moves very quickly here. So it looks like we started off with a King's Indian. After e4, black plays the newer move order with d6, although Bobby Fischer did say that there's no need to play d6. You can allow this e5 idea, although I prefer not to. And h3 is a very modern treatment of the opening. It's a way to try and restrict the bishop from coming to g4, and in many lines, white actually plays g4. So now we have a couple more moves, and this is where we are. This is the live position of the game. So let's catch up on our analysis board as well.
Absolutely. Get there on the big giant board.
Yes.
Fabulous. Yeah, very. I don't have a lot of experience with playing these structures. I dabbled in the King's Indian back probably when I was playing chess in college, but I think the only thing I understood about that opening was the idea of pushing the f pawn as quickly as possible and trying to checkmate them on the king side, which ain't bad, but not quite enough to beat top flight competition.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting way to play as black. I really like the King's Indian because it is a good way to mix up the position right away. By not allowing any trades in the center, you're giving white a big center, but at the same time, there's a lot of attacking ideas. And similarly, if this bishop eventually gets freed, black is going to have a very strong position. And a lot of times you'll see e5, and sometimes black even then takes on d4 in order to give that bishop some scope.
Absolutely. You know, I cannot resist the temptation to harken back to our weekly roundup and say, Tyler, if you are watching, check out how useful this pawn is on d6 instead of on e6, doing a great job of not only reinforcing this pawn break of e5 that Andrew's just mentioned, but also just keeping white from doing the same thing with too much power, right? Of course, e5 is possible in this position.
Yeah, and it looks like black actually just blundered a little bit with knight d7. So we can take a look at this position, and white has this very strong idea of pushing e5 right away. This knight is in trouble. If it goes to h5, there's g4 ideas picking off the knight, and there's also this very strong idea of e6. And after e6, black's structure is totally ruined. We're still going to be attacking this knight at our leisure. So in this specific position, I would almost certainly play g4 and win the knight for a slew of pawns. Something like this is possible, and we could end up with, I believe it's 3 pawns for the knight, but these pawns are not terribly healthy. So I think that would be winning for black. I'm sorry, excuse me, winning for white. But just another idea, this e6 push, and these positions are almost always exceptionally strong for white. Moves like knight g5 and e6 is terminally weak, and we're also threatening to take on h5. So a move like knight b6, which is defending e6 indirectly, we can play bishop takes h5. And the key point is that queen takes d1 looks good. It looks like it would trade off this attacker, but the bishop can simply come back from h5 and white's up a clean piece.
Yet another one of these boomerang effects that I'm so fond of.
Yes.
Although we don't have the beautiful boomerang shape with the bishop on h5, right? Not quite as fun as a boomerang knight.
No, I actually won a game in about 12 moves once with this exact pattern, with e6 and then taking on h5. But I just have fond memories of the days when I was playing d4 on move 1.
I once won a game in 8 moves doing the same idea, and it was against a man that was 15 feet tall and half a mile wide.
Now you're just showing off. It looks like white, Charlie did miss that, so he castled instead. So, and this is a good reminder. You really have to start thinking right away. So Charlie used almost no time on this move, and after castling, he's really letting black off the hook. Black was then able to play e5, and now we have a very normal-looking King's Indian, and I think black is doing perfectly fine in this position. Black will consider a move like c6 later, and black should be doing quite well.
it's funny, I have to say, as a coach, how much little things like this can change so radically depending on the results of the game, at least in the mind of the student, right? This is nothing to do with Charlie personally, but more to do with the many, many 7, 8, 9, and 10-year-olds that I have taught over the years. And if they win the game later, they will shrug their shoulders at me pointing out a tactic like this and say, yeah, but it didn't really matter, right? But if they lose the game, this sort of thing is one that they cannot let go.
Yes, I think you're exactly right. And in this position, White compounded his mistake by capturing on e5. I don't know. Do you want to talk about capturing on e5 and why I hate that move? Or I guess it's
Andrew,
also my...
Tell us how you really feel.
Yeah, it's my disgust, so I'm happy to share my thoughts on it as well.
No, please. Let's try and play a game of read the mind of the master here. I would think a couple of things that I notice out of this. Number one is that White is playing with a space advantage. And so typically when you're playing with a space advantage, you want to do things like continue to crunch your opponent and avoid exchanges. As I'm fond of saying, if you don't have a big enough apartment for your party, you could try to get a bigger apartment, or you can just ask a few people to leave. And so when you're dealing with problems of lack of mobility and where to put your pieces, trading a few off often takes care of that problem. And sometimes even your opponent's space advantage turns into overextension, where suddenly a strength turns very dramatically into a weakness. So, point being, if that's the nature of the game and how it seems to be declaring itself, taking not only resolves some pawn tension in the center and lets a few more exchanges happen, it also allows Black to bring this d7 knight well into the game, as maybe he can take back on e5, not only reaching a much better position than he has on d7, blocking the light squared bishop, but also exchanging on f3. Andrew, how'd I do?
You did very well. The one other thing that I want to point out is that in this structure, it's totally symmetrical with one exception, the pawn structure specifically. And that's that White has pushed the c4 pawn all the way to c4, and Black's pawn is still back on c7. Now, you might quickly think that this is giving us more space with the white pawn here, but I think that the fact that Black can play c6 and keep a knight out of this d5 square is very, very telling. And in fact, the plan for Black is to bring a knight to d4. In fact, the plan for Black is to bring both knights to d4, and he's going to spend a lot of time rerouting this knight on f6 so that it can 2-eye this d4 square.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very, very much a kind of positional consideration that I don't see younger players, let's say younger players of any age, if you take my meaning, take advantage of, is the fact that when you have both neighbor pawns to a file moved forward, there are one or sometimes even two squares that can become pretty seriously weakened. Now, the d3 square is close enough to White's pieces and also reachable by the queen and light squared bishop that it's not such a concern. But as you say, this d4 square and even sometimes this f4 square, these can be very difficult dark squares to hold. Because they are more difficult for White to defend. But of course, the center square in particular, keeping with my theme.
Exactly. And in fact, after d takes e5, so I don't like that move to begin with, Black took back with the knight. I don't like taking with the knight here. It is giving you a little bit of space because the position is very cramped, but the key feature is once again this d4 square. And after we trade off this pair of knights, we have fewer knights that can go to d4.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. So Black not understanding the nature of his strategy there.
Exactly. And again, this is pretty nuanced stuff. It's not something that I knew until I had played an awful lot of chess and had it explained to me in very small words that I could understand.
You do always benefit from those small words.
I do, yes.
Yeah, I do see a little bit, even with my my less experienced eyes for this position, I can see a little of what you're talking about, though, that even just the fact that the queen exchanges might happen is not necessarily, if black was playing for a draw, maybe that sort of thing could make you happy, right? Relieving the pressure. But here, I almost a few turns ago would have rather kept the queens on and started thinking about attacking, where now I can see how it's wending its way towards an equal game.
Yes, and with that in mind, let's go back to our top board for a moment. I think there are a couple of things that are worth looking at there very quickly. So we had talked about this plan of rook b1 and rook b4 to bring another rook into the game and just try and attack that way. So what happened after queen b2 was that white played c4. And this is a similar idea. The idea is to, again, maybe bring the rook in, but to do it in such a way that we're not giving away these pawns on a2 and c2. So one idea would be to play a3, defending this pawn with the rook, and then when we play rook b1, we can still lift the rook later under more favorable circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Andrew, I have to ask, we had discussed doing some player profiles earlier in our pre-show meeting. How are we coming along at being able to tell people who they're watching here and a little bit more about them?
Yeah, I think we can pull up some headshots and take a look at some of these things in just a moment. Let's finish going over this game, and then we'll take a look at the games and see how we're doing.
Fabulous.
So after bishop e6 was played, white decided to go forward with rook e2, immediately hitting the queen. And black, I think correctly, decided to go back to this c5 square, where the queen still has some scope, and the queen is also defending the king side reasonably well.
Absolutely. So, Andrew, I think I know what you're about here, but I can't help but notice you pointed out the queen ducking and running with queen c5, and somehow you're not so interested in picking up this pawn. Are you worried about the state of the queen or the state of the bishop after something like bishop takes c4?
Definitely a little bit. The queen capturing is immediately going to run into rook c1 and taking on c7, and I think that the rook on c7 is much stronger than any of black's rooks, and furthermore, this d6 pawn can get very weak.
Absolutely. Oh, it does. Interestingly enough, I pointed it out, and now it has happened. We have here this, after queen b4, we have a3, similar to what we were talking about, but Rufus went for this queen c4, and white did not answer with, I think, the necessary rook to c1. We had instead knight to d4, trying to go after this light-squared bishop, and then Rufus responded with c5 and knight takes, followed, I presume, yes, absolutely, with, of course, f takes e. What else? I think probably queen takes would be a little bit less than optimal, would be a polite way to say it. Okay, and now we have this move, rook to c1. But of course, this move is not as strong anymore because the weakness of the backward pawn on c7 has been turned into the strength of the position after this advance. So very often we see this, right? I talk to my chess students, I talk to my math students, that the order of the operations can sometimes make all of the difference. Sometimes when you find your tactic isn't working, that it's not a matter of finding new moves, but rather just changing the order in which you're playing them in order to find success.
Yeah, I agree. And it looks like the game continued with queen d5 and now rook d2. This is a very interesting position. I think that white really doesn't have any chances to win the game anymore. There are just too many pawns that black has in the center of the board. But I do think that white is going to have excellent chances to hold a draw if he can pick off this d6 pawn.
Yeah, I mean, you got to think probably the only move, in my opinion, here would have to be something like queen to f5, right? As, of course, we're setting a bit of a trap that if white goes too quickly for this d6 pawn, he runs smack into queen f2 check, not only keeping black in the driver's seat materially, but also opening up the king still more.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning that queen b3 is also an idea. I don't love queen b3, however, because we can probably move the queen out of the way to some place like g4, and we just have an awful lot of threats at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that line, Andrew. I'm actually going to stay on that for just one more minute.
Yes.
Because there is such an easy rookie mistake. I know that you wouldn't do this, but frankly, I might. Playing d5 here, thinking that you are securing your pawns in the center, unfortunately blocks the ability of the queen on b3 to defend and
Right.
loses the entire house. After queen e6 check, the king will move, and we can even come back and pick up on d5 as well.
Yes, and I think in this position, White could even consider playing for win after winning the C and D pawns.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. Actually, I didn't even right. The losing the house was even more accurate than I'd realized. Probably that c5 pawn is also not long for this board.
Yeah, so it looks like Queen F5 was played, and I don't know if you want to take this moment to do a quick introduction of our players, and while we have a quiet moment in some of the games.
I would love to. If you can, I will introduce Mr. Aaron Carey with the white pieces as briefly as I can. We know that he attended Zavarian Brothers High School. We know that he is a sometimes player of the card game Magic the Gathering. But unfortunately, as we went to print, so to speak, this was the only thing we were given that Aaron felt best represented him. So I will make no further comment. You may all take it as you will, but some indication as to Aaron's life philosophies and hobbies.
Yes, and again, since we all went to the same high school, we are giving a little bit of a nod to Aaron, even though in this game it doesn't look like it's going so well for him.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is true. We do have to pull for the alma mater, even if it was an all boys Catholic high school. And boy, was that an experience that we will deal with another time in another broadcast.
Yes,
But
definitely.
moving over with the black pieces, we have our international traveler, Rufus Bear. Rufus is very much a strong and improving player. And, for someone with around, I think, a 1300, 1400 USCF over the board rating, he is playing significantly stronger than that. So let me see what I can tell you about Rufus. He started playing chess again after having been taught how to play as a young boy in his senior year of high school. Right after his senior year, he worked in China as a tech intern with a US company that outsources their tech to China and India. That company then hired him thereafter to work as a remote data scientist whilst in college. And he is now studying for his Bachelor's of Science in Computing Science and Mathematics at Aberdeen in Scotland. Previous to that, I believe he was at RPI. So a very accomplished young man, very well-traveled, and truly an excellent chess player that I'm really enjoying watching and playing against.
Yeah, and I think we've had a couple more moves in that game, and I think these are definitely the two strongest players in the tournament so far, and I think they're probably both at least 1900 strength in terms of USCF ratings. So it's a very strong tournament, and they're both doing very well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll see if we can introduce our board two in just a minute, but we are seeing so much action here; it's hard to keep up. So, Andrew, can you update me on what's been happening?
Yeah, so it looks like after Queen F5, White didn't want to have anything to do with this sacrifice in the weak back rank, and instead he just played the move F3, which closes the F file. So F3 usually weakens the king pretty significantly, but here with only the queen and two rooks on the board, it's less of an issue. There's no bishop d4 ideas. There's no knight hopping in, so the move F3 doesn't have all the drawbacks that it would usually have. And here
Absolutely.
we had a couple more moves, and I believe that now Black's considering what would happen if he takes on A3. The idea of taking on A3 would be that we do get a passed A pawn to go there past C pawn. The downside is that we are giving up the E6 pawn.
I have to say, I do not like that plan at all. I understand that the A pawn would be relatively quick, but the way that this king is already exposed with the movement of the G pawn and the exchange of the F pawn onto the E file, if this pawn goes, I have to think that white is going to have opportunities for at least a perpetual. But the number of quick checkmates you're going to have to manage for the rest of the game seems to me like a completely unnecessary burden.
Yeah, and I do think there are a couple of things to be aware of. The move Queen A3 was, which is going to force off the
Andrew,
queens.
excuse me, sorry, I lost audio for a moment.
Oh, yes, I can still hear you, though. So it looks like here White is forced to trade queens, and after pawn takes, we're going to have to decide as white how to stop these pawns. I think we really have to take this c5 pawn immediately, and after a move like rook b8, putting both rooks behind both pawns, I would be hard-pressed to believe that white is going to be able to hold this without some heroic measures. And here I think that the strongest move, instead of pushing to b2, would be to bring the other pawn into the game, and now we would have these connected passed pawns.
Yes, absolutely. These connected passers being so vital because not only do they help defend themselves, which makes your task of pushing them much easier, but also we can see how one pawn is rather easily blockaded, right? This pawn moves to b2, a rook comes to b1. But when this a pawn gets involved, he can sometimes be the spoon that scoops that rook out of that square and gets everything rolling again. So if both of these pawns go without any losses, I agree. It looks pretty simple for black to convert the point.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's going to be important for white to not capture on e6 and instead to think about the position a little bit and try and figure out a way to continue.
Absolutely.
The move rook d3 does spring to mind. Again, that's a little bit surprising because we're giving up pressure here. But the idea is that we'll be able to put this queen back on a good square later after the black queen moves away from a3, where it's extremely well placed.
Absolutely. Would that Aaron could hear you. It looks like he did, unfortunately, go for this rook e6 idea. And credit to Rufus, queen b3, putting a double attack on the queen on d1, which is not so much a target, but maybe we'd call it a positional target, as black does want to make this exchange, right? And the true target of the loose rook on e6. And Andrew, you said that you felt exchanging queens was forced here. What is it about this position that makes you think, what am I missing here that queen e2 is completely impossible?
I think it's certainly possible. I don't think it solves the problems of the position. We can immediately push the a pawn, and then the way that Rufus played with queen b5, we're pinning this queen to the king, and I believe that's going to force a capture here. A move like rook c4 is going to run into a move like a3, and this pawn is very, very quick.
That's true. Yeah, that does look very scary. Of course, Rufus can't push it right away, as the queen would be able to take and still guard the rook on c4. But probably very quickly, even just a move like rook to b8, and now there's even ideas of the queen checking first and then pushing the pawn.
Yes, and like the other thing that black can consider is putting a rook on e8 and pinning everything. The rook on e8 is defended a sufficient amount of times so that we don't have to worry about hanging a rook on e8.
I haven't seen that many pins since my last costume fitting. I'll see myself out. Listen, you bring the technical know-how and I'll bring the dad jokes and we'll come through this okay.
Sounds great. So I do like what white has played here with queen c4. I think if you're going to allow the queens to be traded, this is as good as you can hope to do. I think that black is going to be forced to either move the king or trade queens now, and I think trading queens makes a lot more sense.
Oh, yes, absolutely. With the exposure of the king here, one of the things that I tell my students is very simply evaluating whose king is less safe very often tells you who wants to be trading queens if material is equal and you don't have some of those more obvious and more basic ways to evaluate. And here we can definitely conclude that black's king is less safe, as he has virtually no pawn shield to the unless you are solely attacking via the G and H files.
Yes, exactly.
It's been a while since we've checked in with Charlie and Alex. We've had a little bit of action there. What can you tell me?
Yeah, so as we're pulling up that game, let's take a look at it. It looks like after we traded on e5, white decided to keep the queens on and played queen c2. Queen c2, the idea is to bring the rook to the d file where it's well placed and gain a tempo on the queen. And black responded with c6. Again, we talked about the c6 idea controlling the d5 square. And white continued development with bishop e3. We can play bishop e3 because knight g4 is not possible thanks to this h3 move. And we continued with queen c7. We brought the a rook to the d file. instead of the f rook. I think it really is fine to do it in either way, and frequently the rooks will be doubled there. And then we had the slightly surprising move f4, and white is trying to take advantage of his lead in development to open the position. I don't know how to feel about this f4 move. It's definitely double-edged because we are allowing black to open up this bishop. And after f4, I believe we had the move bishop h6, pinning this pawn to the e3 bishop. The downside, of course, is that we're moving the bishop from g7 where it's extremely well placed, and now white decided to trade off all these dark square pieces by playing queen to c1, and we actually had a big trade here, and in fact the queens were traded, and I believe this is where we are in the live position with the white rooks doubled up and attacking the knight.
I have to say, this is a really interesting and instructive example to me, because what I see is white very much following principle, but not so well understanding the subtleties of this particular kind of position. Because going back a few steps here, putting both rooks on potential open files, right? This rook belonging on the d file is obvious. This rook here on f1 staying behind to maybe open a file with f4. It makes a lot of sense if you're only evaluating in some of these basic ways that we've admittedly talked about for weeks of activating your pieces. But the downside of this activation is not only the way that it allows more exchanges and eases black's task, as you already mentioned, right? This, as my coach would call it, this stupid piece on g7, right, has less of an issue as the structure opens up. But also, I'm really struck at the end of all of this by the sudden weakness of the e-pawn, and how white had a very solid position in which he could sit and exert pressure and wait for a mistake. And now we see black has very easy active play. A little bit of pressure on the f-file, right? I'm certainly not ignoring that, but it looks like with a light squared bishop, with the ability to bring rooks into play, that that we're going to be able to hold on here without too much issue. And I'm interested to see if black can make something of the fact that this pawn is now isolated.
Yeah, although I think in this specific position we have the very strong move e5, and that would just basically liquidate into a position that looks very nice for white.
Yeah, you're quite right. Did I miss something there? Was this a case of black blundering, or have I misevaluated?
I think that the specific trade on f4 favored white because white had access to the f-file so fast.
I see. So perhaps I've underestimated this pressure. I am seeing now how we are basically forced into a position where we have to either move or play this rook e6 move. And as soon as I saw this come on board, I will admit I thought, that looks really strange. It doesn't seem like a natural place. You can see the way that it blocks your pieces and creates disharmony.
Yes, exactly. And I think that white did, in fact, miss e5. Instead, he played bishop g4, which has a similar idea. And the rook cannot move. Certainly it can't go to d6 because of this fork. So black took on g4, and now white has the in-between move. Rook takes f7 check, and after king h6, white recaptures on g4, and I think this is a very strong position for white.
Now, Andrew,
sure,
I know that you love the term in-between move, but I have to show my international flavor and call it how I see it, which is known as a Zwischenzug.
Yes.
You were about to say something.
Yes, so we had a good question from the chat, whether the plan of playing c5 and knight a4 would be strong for white. I like this plan a lot. I think that there's no rush to play it. It certainly makes more sense to go for these forcing moves first and pick off this f7 pawn. But if white does have a quiet moment, this plan of c5 is very strong. It restricts all of these black pawns on light squares where they make the bishop very bad. And then we can think about where we want to place the knight. Both b6 and d6 are very strong squares for the knight after c5.
Absolutely. I think we'd better return to our top board. I see an awful lot of simplification has occurred here. Looks like the queens have come off on c4, and now we are into a double rook endgame where black is going to try and make something out of his pawns.
Yeah, and I think white got the best possible version of the queen trade here. I think white has excellent chances to hold the draw. After rook d4, I think it's a critical moment already for white. White has to decide whether he's going to go for some sort of counterattack or if he's going to just try and defend somewhat passively and try and take the a3 pawn off that way. And white decided to go for this counterattack, and after rook takes c5, a3 was played, and now white has a couple of options. White can either put the rook behind the pawn and again try and pick it off, or white can go for rook c7 and rook e7. I think it's clearly more correct to play rook c7 first, because if you play rook e7, this pawn is very close to queening and there's not a good way to stop that. So rook c7 would be an idea, and now if rook a4, white has at least a draw with this move.
Absolutely, yes, because there will be so many perpetual checks. I have to say, I love looking at a position like that as a coach. It shows me something that really wonderfully illustrates how difficult it is to play top level chess, because you have, in a position like that, you have this choice by white between putting the rook behind the pass pawn, as Ziegbert Tarash told us, it is always correct except when it is incorrect to do so, and seizing the 7th rank, which we have also been told is the right idea. So what do you do when your two guiding principles seem to directly contradict each other?
Yeah, and I think it truly comes down to some experience and calculating a couple of very specific lines to see what will happen.
Absolutely. You have to couch it in the concrete.
Yes, and just to catch up with the game, because the game is going into an interesting idea. Aaron decided to put the rook behind the pawn immediately, and Aaron's going to pick off this a3 pawn, and I believe Aaron's actually playing for a win here. And after rook d1, king f2, black played rook to a1 to defend the pawn, and this should be a very quick draw, almost no matter what. Unless black goes a little bit nuts and makes a mistake. But here we have two options. White can win either one of these pawns because the black rooks cannot defend both of them. So I'll throw it out to you as a little bit of a quiz. Which pawn do you think it would be more correct to win here?
Oh, how nice of you. Well, I have to guess that winning the a3 pawn reduces my defensive burden by quite a bit. And helps me to breathe easier. So from a practical standpoint, that's my immediate answer. I suppose that if we won the less advanced pawn, that we would, maybe positionally. So if I can manage to win this less advanced pawn, I guess positionally that's more likely to make me happy, because I will end up with the rook behind the final passer instead of in front of it.
Yes, you're exactly right. The key feature in this position is that white wants to stay behind the passed pawn. So if he plays a move like this and allows the black king to start activating, the white rook is very passive in front of the pawn. So even though the pawn is further up the board, it's back on a6, it's going to be extremely difficult for white to corral the a6 pawn without making some serious concessions by bringing the king all the way to the queen side.
Absolutely.
So this would be the more correct plan, to win the a6 pawn and leave the rook on an active square. And in fact, in this position, white can actually think about playing for the win. And the winning plan here, and again, it looks like there are some ideas for black to hold the draw, but white is definitely in the driver's seat. White's going to bring the king up the board, and white is going to have this key idea of taking the a3 pawn and defending the f3 square with the rook. So if black decides to play something like this, and again, this wouldn't happen right away, the rook will be holding f3, and that should be enough to at least have a good position with the white pieces, and we can play forever with the extra pawn.
I see, right, because you are able perhaps to advance to g4 when you need to, and know that you've got this base of your structure soundly protected.
Exactly.
That makes sense to me. It's wild to see how this game has gone back and forth. I have to say, no matter what the result, we can say these two players were pretty evenly matched.
Yes, definitely. And it looks like it'll be a draw now, just because there are so few pawns left on the board. Aaron played rook e7, which restricts the king nicely. And now Aaron's going to think about maybe pushing the h pawn to try and loosen things up that way. Maybe bringing the king in. If the king comes to h6, it should be completely winning. But again, it's going to be a double edged position because now black does have the option to push the pawn to a2 and maybe activate the other rook while this rook is misplaced.
Absolutely. And you have to be careful because, of course, as long as the king stays on the G file, he should be okay. But if you're trying to advance the king this way, there's always an opportunity that black might be able to advance the pawn to A2 and then play a check, right?
Mm-hmm.
And win a free move that gets the queen home. So you have to be careful sometimes when positions are pretty drawish and you start playing for a win. Sometimes there is a full point, but it doesn't go your direction.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And no matter what, white is still down a pawn, so white's going to have to take a moment to get the pawn back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Andrew, why don't we take a moment here? We'll offer an update in just a moment here on our board 2 game, but let's take a second to meet these players.
Yeah, definitely. And let's take a look at the other game, and we'll take a look, and you can introduce us to our white player, Charlie.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we have met Charlie Larimer in another one of our live broadcasts as he held, I think, the white pieces then as well against Lenny Shogun and was able to put him away in an end game after another very back and forth and interesting game. But here he is again. Charlie Larimer's father taught Charlie and his brother Rob how to play chess when they were both quite young. Important to note that Robert is also participating in our tournament, as well as Robert's son, Andrew. So we have got quite a coterie of Larimers participating. He, Charlie, frequently plays chess online, either at Lee Chess or chess.com, where he typically plays 5-minute games. So this extended format, a little bit of a change for our hero. After living in Chicago for 43 years, he now lives in beautiful Denver, Colorado, where he works as a healthcare actuary. So no stranger to math and logic is Mr. Larimer. Followed by his competitor with the black pieces, Alex Host. I'm just meeting Alex for the first time as a part of this tournament, and I have to say I'm really delighted that he's joined us. Just a short bio from Alex. He's a grad student at Johns Hopkins University studying philosophy, with a particular focus on Kant and Hegel. He started playing chess a little over a year ago, but has embraced it enthusiastically. Really amazing progress, I have to say, for less than a little more than a year.
Definitely.
He was invited to join this tournament by his uncle. That would be Bill Baxter Stoltzfus, who had a nice win a few minutes ago. And he is already learning a lot. Very grateful to be here. So we're very grateful to have you, Alex. Thanks for participating.
Yeah, and let's take a look at our analysis of that game, and we can go back and see a couple of the moves that led to this position. So we left off after white played this plan of winning the f7 pawn, and white recaptured on g4, and white now has double g pawns. So black responded with b5, and I think this is a correct idea to try and give the bishop some scope. And now white could have played c5. Instead, he decided to take on b5. I don't know how that works out if you're playing for the win. I think if you're playing for the win, it makes more sense to play c5 instead.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to think that part of what you're thinking there is just the way that after A takes B, that the A8 rook has been given a free hand, right? I mean, of course, you can't take right away, but think about the energy that you have to devote leaving this knight here for the rest of the game if you don't want this A2 pawn to hang. That's not the way we want to use our pieces.
Yeah, and I do think white maybe had an opportunity to double the rooks on the 7th. And with the king up on h6, there are going to be an awful lot of mating ideas that come very quickly here. So a move like b4, we can probably tuck the knight on e2 for a moment, and then something like this to attack the rook. And there are just going to be dozens and dozens of mating ideas that come up very, very quickly.
Yeah, it's hard to see in that immediate, right? The dropping of the two pawns looks a little worrisome, but I do see what you mean. That if we can find the time to get this rook here to f7, that rook takes h7 is going to be completely unavoidable, and the king is going to have to start scrambling for squares in order to stay alive. And it's never a good sign when, in order to find safety, you're being pushed closer to the opponent's pieces, right? It's a good chance that you're going to end up checkmated when that starts happening. As notice, this king can be extremely useful at controlling some key squares. So even if the black king were to end up somewhere like here, that is not a good sign, right? That is not a place you want to be with especially with two rooks still on the board.
Right, and I do like the way that White chose to play. B4 makes a lot of sense to kind of keep this knight on a good square, and we are restricting the a8 rook with the pawn. So if the rook comes to a3, for example, White is going to have a couple of options to develop the knight, maybe to h3, but just somewhere where the knight can control this g5 square.
Yes, absolutely. To bring online some of those mating ideas that we were seeing, right? If you control this, the pawn already controls the other two light squares, and suddenly a successful rook check would be fatal. Right?
Yes.
Obviously not right now, but we need our brother in arms here to make.
So just to catch up to the live position, Black brought the rook back to e8 to stop pins on the 8th rank, and White decided to give away this g5 pawn in order to win the h7 pawn and to potentially double rooks on the 7th rank.
Very
Black
good.
fought back against that by playing bishop e6 to cover the f7 square, and rook f2 was played to hold a2, and after bishop c4, we had the moves rook c7 hitting the c6 pawn, and then rook a3 attacking the knight and picking up a tempo that way.
I have got to say that this kind of bishop e6 move is the kind of thing that says to me always that your position has to be improved by such a move. When you can combine attack and defense this way, it is always a good sign you're doing at least something right.
Yes,
this bishop has multiple purposes.
And that's really one of the reasons that bishops coordinate so well with rooks. They just do totally different things, and they're able to both attack and defend on both sides of the board at the same time.
Absolutely. We do have a couple more moves here, looks like, on the board where White's knight has ended up on a rather ignominious square of b2. Let's take a look at how that happens. So we did have rook to a3, followed by knight to b1. I'm not so sure that that's the kind of place I want to be with this knight. I think probably knight to d1 made a lot more sense because this e3 square looks much more useful to me. But Andrew, what do you think?
I agree. I think we're going to have to see if White is going to try and trade everything off and make a draw, or if White's going to play a move like knight to d2 and have some threats of knight f3 and potentially winning this rook. So for just as a totally made up line,
my favorite.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not even sure how to do this because it's so contrived. We'll just say rook d8. Maybe something like knight f3 check, and after the king moves, I guess we could take this pawn and maybe try and have an extra pawn in this endgame and try and run one of these kingside pawns. But again, this is all very contrived, and it looks like we're headed for a draw here with best play.
We had a thought out of the chat actually about maybe White missing this threat after knight d2 would go for something like rook takes c6.
Yeah, I just can't find a way for Black to pass the move here.
Oh yes, of course, yeah. Reacting a little too quickly.
Maybe bishop g8 back to c4 as a completely contrived position would hang the rook. Unfortunately, even after rook takes c4, Black can throw in rook a1, another Zwischenzug, to use the correct German. And here we would just have an extra exchange with Black, and Black would have decent winning chances after rook takes e4.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love using the German terms, if only because it's so fun to watch my elementary school students try and pronounce them.
Yes.
And before you think I'm making fun of them, I swear they pronounce them as awfully as possible, specifically to make fun of me. So don't feel too bad.
Yeah, so the game continued with trading a pair of rooks on a2, followed by knight d2, And now black defended this c6 pawn with rook e6 check, and white played knight f3 check. So now black is going to have to decide how to continue.
Let's take a minute here while black is mulling that over and take a look back at our top board. It looks like all of the pawns on the queen side have been exchanged, and now we've got a position where white appears to be in the driver's seat, as not only do we have white holding an extra pawn, but really very active rooks, and again, this problem of the exposed king. Black's king, without any pawn cover, if he can manage to perhaps play king to g7 and king to h6 and find a way to tuck himself away, then maybe we'll have something. But fortunes seem to have shifted.
Yeah, and I don't like this rook b1 move. I think giving away this a3 pawn is a move of desperation, and I don't think it's good. So we got to this position where white is threatening to just pick off this pawn, and unfortunately there's really nothing that can be done about that. And now white captured this a5 pawn, and black actually has to decide whether to trade a pair of rooks or to keep all of the rooks on the board.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like right now he's made the decision largely to keep them on, I guess, trying to create more complications. It is worth noting here, as it has really not been a major factor in any of the games we've played today so far, but it does appear to be becoming a factor now, and that is the ticking clock. We see that Aaron with the white pieces has only 6 minutes left, while Rufus has a little bit under 12.
Yes, and I think in this position, I would trade a pair of rooks personally. I think that the draw is going to be easier with one rook and these two pawns, especially if black can bring the king up to kind of defend this g6 pawn. Black decided to try and keep the rook in order to get something going on the 7th rank, but white found the correct move, rook g5, threatening to take on g6, and if we double rooks here, white has the simple idea of king h3, unmasking this rook to defend the g2 pawn, and all of a sudden white's rooks are much more active than the black rooks, because we are covering this g2 pawn so well. So a move like king f7 to defend the pawn is met by rook a6, and this pawn is a goner, and I think after that pawn falls, that's really all there is to say about the position. The two extra pawns should be sufficient to win, especially because the h5 pawn will go eventually.
Yeah, it looks like Rufus made at least the more correct decision to bring his rook back and defend with rook to d6, which does double service, not only defending the pawn, but preventing the entry of the white rook onto the 6th rank.
Yes, so I believe here I would play rook a7, and it looks like Aaron has in fact just played rook a7, and that's a strong way to cut off the king and to perhaps have some ideas of back rank mates by moving this rook over. And again, the black position is just getting more and more passive, and what would we give to have this pawn back on g7 or to have a pawn on f7 so that the king could escape from the back rank?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really tough to see. I think Rufus is probably very much regretting his decision not to trade a pair of rooks right now.
Yes, I think you're right. And I think if I had to handicap it, I'd say there's a 40% chance of a white win and a 60% chance of a draw. So that's quite the turnaround from the initial game when we had black with all the chances.
Absolutely. Really interesting. I have to admit, a draw would make for actually a very exciting result in this particular case, as it would leave the field that much more open for the remaining competitors. So I'm not sure where my heart is on this one, Andrew.
Yes, I agree. It's I think I'm just rooting for good chess, and we'll see what happens from there.
Very good call. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm hoping that Rufus probably, I think he's got to admit when he's in trouble and bring this rook back, that he can, first of all, defend these back rank threats, but also get an idea of maybe being able to exchange one of these rooks off, and we can get back more towards some of the positions you were talking about earlier.
Yes, exactly right. And I think we'll have to see if black can find some defensive ideas here. It's quickly becoming critical, and I think he's going to have to find those ideas right away.
Absolutely.
Let's
exactly.
take a look at the other game real quick and see what's happening, because there have been a bunch of moves there, and I think we're getting extremely close to a draw in that game.
It's always a sign of a good partnership when you can finish each other's thoughts.
Yes.
So let's see here. I get lost looking at how many moves have happened since. I must confess, Andrew, can you help me make sense of how
Yeah,
things
so
have
this is where
developed
we
here?
left off with the knight check. The king went back, which I believe is more correct. If the king comes forward, you're always running a little bit of a risk of walking into some sort of forks or checkmates with moves like knight d4 on the board or g3 potentially at some moment. So like king f2 might be an idea. You can't take here with the king because of knight g5 forking. So again, it's just a position where you have to be a little bit careful. Even a move like rook takes e4 looks a little bit scary because all of these pawns are going to fall, and there's always this g3 idea to cause some chaos in the position.
Yeah, absolutely. Something like that might be a way of separating the king from the rook on e4 at a key moment and pulling
Yes,
the defender away.
yes,
Yeah, so
exactly.
instead, we had king to f6. It looks like we had a knight sally into d4,
Mm-hmm.
rook capturing on e4, grabbing this pawn, rook taking c6 to keep the material balance, and of course with check.
Yep,
And then, uh,
we brought the bishop
ooh,
back to defend, which looks surprising to pin ourselves, especially because there's a lot going on here. But I believe that with all of the pawns coming off, it should be reasonably straightforward to hold the draw here.
that may have worked out, but I gotta say, now it's my turn to feel a little bit ill at the thought. A bishop e6 move like this, putting yourself in a pin, and which is worse, into pressure of two pieces. I suppose, right, when you calculate carefully, you can do just about anything, but this makes my stomach turn to think about doing that to yourself. It seems like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I think the only saving grace is that with all of the pawns coming off, there's really no threats. And here, I think this is as close as we can get to some sort of forced draw. And right away, I don't see what is left to play for.
Have to say, was really surprised to see two draws being very possible right now.
Yes.
Not the result I expected, but there's still an awful lot of chance for both sides to bring home the point in our top board, because Aaron's time is really starting to tick down now, and as much as his rooks are much improved over Rufus's, I still think there's a lot of risk here just because of how little time he has to calculate.
Yeah, and let's take a look at that to see what happened. So we saw rook b4 was the last move. White brought the rook to c5, threatening mate. I would be shocked if Rufus hung mate. He did not. And now White decided to take this opportunity to try and march the king up the board. I think that's a very strong plan, and that does have a real winning potential, especially if the king can come to h6, where it's going to zone out the black king and maybe have some mating ideas this way.
I have to take note here of a very simple idea, and one that I don't expect players of this caliber to fall into. But how many times in how many games, Andrew, have you seen the black player here make a move like rook to b4 check, just trying to harass the king and actually driving the king
Yes.
further into where he wants to go?
Yeah, and I think that brings up a really good point. Black decided to try and threaten the g2 pawn to slow down the white king, and now white decided to sacrifice the g2 pawn and play king g5 anyways. So that's giving away g2 with check, defending this square, but Aaron's idea is that the king on h6 is so strong that there are just going to be mating ideas, and this position looks completely winning for white.
Oh, that's a tough ending there for Rufus. We'll see if he can dig out something and maybe get a bit lucky, but I think it's probably going to take a big mistake, which maybe the time pressure will help with, for Aaron to give this game away.
Yeah, and here the easiest way to win looks to me to be rook c to c7, rook check followed by rook to h7, and then mate will be unavoidable on g8. So as an example, if black starts taking pawns, we can play like this. And here we're threatening mate in 1, so the king has to come back, and then after rook g7, it's simply mate on h8.
Mm,
And this is
mm.
actually a very good pattern to know. If you have two rooks on the 7th rank, they cannot give mate on their own. So I'm just going to make a couple of random moves to demonstrate my point. The king stays on h8 and g8, and there's no good way to mate because the king can always come back and defend itself on h8. So the mating plan is to defend the g7 square with anything, a pawn, a bishop, a knight, a king. And once g7 is defended, then we have a position like we were just looking at where we can bring the other rook to g7, followed by rook h8. And because the king's defending this rook on g7, it is mate.
So if you were playing the black pieces here and not ready to resign yet, I guess something like g5 would make, excuse me, I better get to the position that we're in. Something like g5 here would be a good idea to at least try and open up some lateral checking possibilities and force the king back.
Yeah, that might be an option. I think after g5, we could consider just bringing the rook up this way because this check is going to run into all of these pawns coming off, and they're still back rank mates. But this looks a little bit difficult. There's a lot to consider. There are perpetual ideas, and the king really has run out of squares to hide on because we don't have access to this f3 square to attack this rook. So black's going to be able to just check forever. Instead, what I think would be the easiest way to win after g5 would be to actually trade a pair of rooks. And here, the black king is so passive that this h-pawn is going to fall. Something like this is entirely possible. And after this h-pawn falls, this f-pawn should be enough to win because it's so far away from the edge of the board and the black king is so passive.
Absolutely, but it would take very solid technique to do something like that in
really
the end
would.
game. And Aaron does not have enough time to make play like that, let's say, easy. Right now.
I
won't
agree.
say.
So,
I won't guess as to its probability.
Yes.
By the way, it's worth noting here for a moment that our board 2 game did finally finish in a draw. Let's quickly just dash through the last couple of moves of that game.
Excellent idea. So we ended up with this king and pawn endgame, and there's very little left to do. And in this position, any king and pawn endgame, you have to be very careful because it's so concrete. One mistake can be the difference between life and death. And after king f3, king f5, we have the opposition, and white played g4 to attack the king and to get the pawn to a safe square. And after king e5, this is really the last chance for black. If white plays a move like king to g3, white can easily lose the game once the king gets forced out of the good square here. But white correctly played king to e3 and just continues to keep the opposition. And now there's really nothing left to do here. So after a couple of moves, I think g5 was played, and we just kind of shuffled a little bit.
Yeah, sort of not with a bang, with a whimper
Yes,
kind
exactly.
of ending after a pretty interesting fighting game where white did miss a kill shot earlier in the competition.
Yeah,
so
there is one more trick to be played here, and black didn't try it, but we'll include it just for completeness. You could try this move king d4, and that's going to force the white king out of the way, and now white has to find king f2, taking the diagonal opposition, and here we're actually giving away this pawn, but despite the fact that we're down a pawn, we still have this opposition, and it's still a draw.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can think of this, if there is such a thing, and there is, a principle of 2 weaknesses in the endgame. You could think of this somewhat similarly, even though there's one pawn, which is that black would need to accomplish 2 tasks. He needs the king to be in front, which he is, but he also has to have the opposition. And without those 2 different advantages over white, it's simply not enough, as there is, unfortunately, a stalemate after
and I just want to interrupt real
here.
quick because we are getting down to the very end of our top board. So while you're showing that, let's jump back here. After king h6, rook takes h2 was played, and now we had this check. The king moved, and Aaron doubled pawns instead of picking off the g6 pawn, which is correct. And now black played g5, trying to make something happen, maybe g4 and rook f2, and now white found the quiet move king to h7, and mate is now unavoidable on g8.
Wow, so we do have, looking like in a matter of moments, another victory for our XBHS star.
Yes, and it looks like we're going to end up with a win on board 1 and a draw on board 2. So let's discuss the standings after that very quickly, because that's going to make the last couple of rounds very interesting. So to just discuss that very quickly, that's going to give Aaron 4.5 out of 5, and Rufus is going to be on 4 out of 5, a half point back. And we're going to have to see what happens on the board 3 game, where Brian and Andrew are both playing with 3 points, and one of them could catch up to be a half point back with 4 out of 5 as well.
Yeah, so it's difficult to see, especially given the ratings of the remaining people to play. Hard to see how anybody's going to be able to catch Aaron after this result, as it does look like we have a resignation on the board.
Yes, we do, and it looks like that's going to give Aaron the win and the sole lead of the tournament by half a point with 4.5 out of 5.
Really well played. Good job to fight back. I mean, certainly some uneven moments, and Black looked like he had some opportunities to win, but really got to give a credit to Aaron for digging in, finding some difficult moves in the rook end game, and being able to come up with a point.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if there are any moments from earlier that you want to take a look at while we're talking about tournament standings and checking out the rest of the games.
Yeah, that's let me take a quick dash through here and see what sticks out to me. I mean, I have to say, I was really intrigued and enjoying this strange position with its unusual pawn structure that we got early in the game. Felt very good about Black's chances here, even despite the strength of the c6 pawn, just because I'm always happy to get rid of White's light squared bishop. I feel like that eases my defensive task. But after an interesting middle game with some significant maneuvering of the queen, right? Black's queen turned into a hero, was able to pick off quite a few pawns, but things sort of started to get rocky right around. Let's say we give it a couple more turns, and as the queens came off and we wended towards the rook endgame, that seems to be where Black lost the thread. And we saw White able to win back a number of these broken up pawns on the queen side of the board. You can see how, being up material is good, but when your pawn structure is so shaky, I think we see the problems of practical chess here, right? Something like, Leela or Alpha Zero, right, would have no difficulty converting a position like this because they play like such geniuses. But it's not so easy to hang on to these things, and White in some ways has an easier task by just being able to attack and cause problems, whereas Black has to play this role of shepherd and babysitter and kind of less romantically bring things up the board to safety.
Definitely, and I think part of it is psychological. When you go from a very strong position that's almost certainly, or it's certainly close to winning. I don't know if it's definitely winning, but with 2 extra pawns, as your opponent comes back into the game, it's very easy to lose track of what's going on and continue to press for the win when you have to reset and start thinking about how to hold the draw and not let your position get any worse.
Absolutely, yeah, and Black may have also been thinking at certain points here, playing for the win, that his significant time advantage was going to help him out. But it didn't seem to ever come into the fold. Aaron was able to keep making strong moves despite being up against some significant pressure.
Yes, you're exactly right. And again, once we get to this rook endgame, I think there's very little that Black can do to actually win in practice. The winning chances were all before the queens were traded.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then, of course, probably the critical mistake, just to wind up our coverage here, would be at this moment, Black should almost certainly accept that a draw is an excellent result for him and trade the rooks.
Yes, I think trading the rooks and immediately bringing the king away from the back rank would give Black enough to hold.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting because sometimes in these games you find that the ending doesn't reflect that lesson quite so beautifully. But I think here, with the way things ended, right, it almost tells a parable-like level of clarity that not removing the rooks led very directly to Black's demise.
Yes, you're right. And I think if we go back a couple of moves, this rook b4 move was really the game ender, so to speak. It was it gave White the chance to activate the king and really put both of the rooks in a position where they were going to have too many threats. So here, I think it was more correct to double the rooks maybe rook d2 or even rook b6. But the idea would be to immediately contest the 7th rank by putting a rook there before white has a chance to double on the 7th rank and control it forever.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just like America, the rooks are stronger together.
There you go.
Andrew, what do you say? Shall we wrap this thing up?
Yes, this was a lot of fun. I think we had a great number of games today, and this was a ton of fun. I really enjoy seeing so many people come out in the chat, and we got some really good questions. And I hope that we get a couple more chances to do this before the tournament wraps up, because it certainly looks like it'll be an interesting run to the finish.
Absolutely. I'd like to make a special mention to all of our combatants today: Aaron Carey, Rufus Bear, Alex Host, and Charlie Larimer, as well as the surprise guests, Dave Morrissey and Bill Baxter Stoltzfus. Thank you all so much for participating in this tournament. And thank you especially to our top 2 boards, who dealt with multiple emails from me to get their biographical information, their photos, and to get them scheduled on the same day. I think it makes a huge difference in the amount of content we're able to cover, keeps the show exciting. So thank you all so much for being willing to share your play with us and be good sports about this whole enterprise. So without further ado, for Andrew Hoy, I'm John Harden, and this has been another episode of Acceptable Chess.